prophetic tradition, but at least pushing it aside mentally or ignoring it and moving on to more fruitful endeavors.
But what I mean by
what is more fruitful?
How to actually achieve some of the objectives of the ummah where you're living, or collectively, on an educational level, on a political level, other things as well.
Okay, could you elaborate a little what you mean by...
Sure, that's what I'm going to do. Permanence in the principles that are going to be contained in Allah's book, and like you mentioned that Quranic ayat, that the book and wisdom, and how that they're two. Now, and the wisdom is an allusion towards prophetic wisdom, both in deeds and words. Now, impermanence and how we apply them. That's what I'm referring to. The permanent it's there. We believe in those enduring principles as a constant, but impermanence and how our relationship to it is. So essentially, our relationship with the Prophet, peace be upon him, is going to be slightly different than it was in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because they never had they not only had the metaphysical, but they had the physical presence of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And at that time, they were also being told to obey, and so it was equal. I would say our relationship is equal but different. So that is those are my queries. That's my inquiry into this aspect of it. Has there been literature written on a differentiation? Because I believe a lot of the debate revolves around not contextualizing. There is the distinction, I believe, between the Quran and Sunnah, and that distinction can also be placed in a time-space factor, where it can't be placed in the Quranic text in a time-space factor.
The people I think that have probably written on that, although they tend to write about the Quran more so than the Sunnah, but the Sunnah comes into their discussions. Muhammad Shahrur in Syria and Abdul Karim Saroush in Iran are writing on modern contextualization. Those are the two people I'm most familiar with, but there are a number of Muslims writing on contextualization rather than rejection of the Hadith.
Sahrur can't be taken seriously because he doesn't know. I mean, Saroush knows, but Sahrur is not.
Okay, so Dr. Ayub, this is your turn now, all right?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, there is a problem, I think, with Shafi'i, and that is his absolute reliance of the hadith, which as I said before, I can see why, led him to a problem, and that is he had to minimize the significance of ijma', and he does that.
Yes.
And when you do that, you fall into the problem of how do we know the Sunnah? You know, if you look at the Seerah literature, there are references to the 5 daily prayers individually, not in any kind of explanation way. Because, for instance, the Prophet said, okay, we will not pray Asr until we attack the settlement of Khaybar, for instance. Bani Qurayza. And so here is a reference to Salat al-Asr, that he sometimes combined the prayers. But the most important, I think, indication for us, and that I use always against people who want to even put Islamic worship in the 2nd century, like Andrew Rippon and so on. And I say, but people have been worshipping that way from the very beginning, and we know this through ijma'. There is not, there is not a madhab in all the madhahib of Islam, those that are extant and those that aren't, that for instance would question the 5 daily prayers, or the fast of Ramadan, or the amount of zakat and so on. And we know these are important, not really directly from the Quran. I mean, the Quran mentions zakat every other verse practically, but the Quran never specifies zakat. We know it through the Sunnah of the Prophet, but the somehow the Sunnah of the Prophet that relates to af'al, that is his actions, has greater tawatur in some ways than the Sunnah of aqwal. And so in that sense, Shafi'i's difficulty by minimizing the significance of ijma' in order to rely more squarely on the Sunnah did create a problem, and the fuqaha after him had to spend a lot of time on this issue. What do we mean by ijma', and how important? And ijma' is extremely important. It can be said that ijma' is both the source of progress in Islam and the source of staying where we are. I don't want to call it stagnation, because I don't believe there was ever stagnation in Islam. That's one Western writer said that after the 10th century, Islamic scholarship stagnated. It did not stagnate. At any rate, that's not the issue. But how does Shafi'i, in your opinion, deal with the issue of ijma'?
Well, Shafi limits ijma' to the af'al. And like I said, the example he gives is that dhuhr is 4. So Shafi agrees that the Muslims have ijma' on the number of prayers and the number of rakahs in the prayer and the way to, the general practice of the prayer and things like the amount of zakat. These are the things, these basic practices of Islam are what Shafi limits the ijma' to. The more detailed the ideas of rulings is where he doesn't accept an idea of ijma'. And he limits ijma' on the acceptance of isolated hadith. He does not give ijma' authority over those hadith, and that's where the problem comes in. He wants to give the hadith, in that case, the authority over the ijma'. But he does admit that ijma' is, Muslims have ijma' on the practices. And that seems to me, that's my understanding of his discussion in the Jama' al-Ilm in particular, and also in the Risala. I think we see this reflected, that he sees the role of ijma' as in the discussion of zakat and salat and siyam and how these things are done, the things that are, and hajj as well. So that there is this idea of ijma' is limited in Shafi's view, as I understand it, to these basic practices, and does not extend to the kind of particular rulings that isolated hadith are used for.
Okay, Dr. Shanqiti.
I want to get back to this point of the relationship between Quran and Sunnah, because I personally get the feeling that if we speak of Quran and Sunnah as two exclusive categories, sometimes we reach the wrong conclusions. Like I believe that is where the opponents of the Sunnah went astray. The very idea of revelation in itself entails the role of the Prophet. There can be no revelation as far